Well, thanks so much. And thank you, Mattilda, for joining. I'm so happy to be with everybody. It's the first public event for To End a Plague, which is a history of a lot of things, but it often gets boiled down to President George W. Bush's AIDS initiative. Even though it was launched in '03 and has persisted to this day, it still gets tied to that one particular president. And so what I want to do before Mattilda and I have a conversation is to read just a little bit about the activist movement that was as instrumental in impelling this this initiative into being as that precedent. And this is going to start in 1998 and with a reference to a couple of my colleagues with whom I worked at Out magazine as a fact checker and an HIV writer at the time. One evening in October 1998, I followed them to the old red brick building holding the Lesbian and Gay Community Center and climbed a narrow staircase to a room filled with queers who were outraged and heartbroken over the recent brutal murder of Matthew Shepard, a young gay college student in Wyoming. The room held authority and experience. Many people were all too familiar with the alchemy of grief, anger, and purpose that begets activism. Ideas appeared, morphed, elided. A political funeral in the ACT UP tradition? Yes. Seeking a permit from the city? Maybe. A pale-skinned, freckled woman with dark hair pinched her first 3 fingers against her thumb and made small circles in the air as she spoke. I guessed that if she could, she'd be smoking. That makes no sense whatso-fucking-ever, Sharon Ann Lynch said in a surprisingly sweet-toned drawl, then laid out a counterplan. On Monday, October 19th, the evening that the Shepard political funeral began, I followed Lynch off the curb of the sidewalk in front of the Plaza Hotel. You're under arrest, you're under arrest, you're under arrest. A cop jerked his thumb at her, then me, then the person next to me. She stepped forward, sat down, and waited to be hauled off. I stepped back, tightened the pink ribbon around my forearm that designated me as a marshal, an activist who would help organize the protest as it moved, and spent the next several hours racing down the center of Fifth Avenue, hand in hand with others, marked by ribbons, seeking to avoid the police and to guide the crowd so large it seized Fifth Avenue. The crowd flowed down the East Side artery, and we raced alongside it, seeking to steer it this way, then that, to avoid the infuriated police who menaced with horses and billy clubs. The city was a body. We were the bloodstream, the throng as large as our grief and anger. I had seldom felt so alive. After that, I would go to any meeting Lynch called in her Alphabet City apartment, smoke-filled sessions discussing AIDS in prison or the feasibility of chaining oneself to the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. It is possible. The activists I met there were, like Lynch, largely unsmiling, unfazed by getting arrested during civil disobedience. Most were white, queer, and enthralling. They made wheat paste to slap up signs for upcoming protests. When the cops busted them, they jumped turnstiles. Later, they laughed. They seldom mentioned where they'd gone to college, if they'd gone at all, or what they wanted to be, as though they only wanted to be themselves. If I was careful to remain taciturn and tactical, I could get dates, but only if I could stay awake. When the meetings ended, the work began, painting banners, making signs. It seemed these activists never slept and seldom ate. So as I was saying to Mattilda before we started, Mattilda was the rare genius who brought snacks and food to these meetings and impressed me at that moment, which is yet another reason why I'm so delighted we're here years later, connecting. It seemed these activists never slept and seldom ate, save for trips across Avenue A to Teresa's, a Polish restaurant with old red booths, springs pressing hard against packing tape patched naga hide gashes for plate-sized latkes, medicinal Jack and Cokes. And that group, which becomes Fed Up Queers, which is a direct action group. They're the first group to become to get arrested in civil disobedience after the police shooting of Amadou Diallo. That group has members that then overlap with another group of longtime activists who are looking at taking on the issue of enormous global inequities in access to AIDS medications. By 1998, the triple combination therapy is available in the US and in wealthy nations and not in low-income nations around the world. And for that matter, not for Black and brown people in many parts of the US. So this follows Lynch into that milieu. One night, Lynch arrived in a basement where Lederer, Riley, and Sawyer, these are all other activists, were debating whether the group's mission statement ought to encompass micronutrients. She'd mastered ACT UP's organizing discipline. You knock down every barrier, and behind every barrier, there's a person who can give you what they want, what you want. In the weeks that followed, as winter turned into spring in New York City, and Philadelphia, the group tried to apply this discipline to the chasm in access to AIDS medications. And what they do is they figure out that the White House is aiding and abetting a lawsuit by the pharmaceutical industry lobby that would seek to pull back South Africa's right to import and make cheap versions of essential medications. When the activists figured out that the White House was stumping for drug companies and not the lives of newly liberated South Africans, they knew they had a media-ready story. They also knew the power of pointing the finger at a single person. Clinton occupied the Oval Office, but it was his vice president, Al Gore, whose public image was most vulnerable. Clinton was set to leave the White House. Gore was about to launch his own presidential campaign. I'd ended up on Sharon Ann's B list of activists, meaning I could not be relied upon to risk arrest and civil disobedience. Still, she knew she needed bodies in the streets, which was why in June 1999, I got a call for a weekend meeting in an apartment on East 11th Street. Gore was going to declare his presidential candidacy in Carthage, Tennessee in a few days' time. At the meeting, Lynch sat with a steno notebook flipped open in her lap. What if the activist drove down to Carthage and disrupted the announcement of his candidacy? Could people do that? There is nothing remarkable at all about the moment when a decision gets made that will change everything. People checked their work schedules. They considered who would rent a car. They talked about how long it would take to drive down. The proposition hung as a bubble in midair, and then there was an astringent certainty. People would drive overnight and confront the candidate when he declared. What would they chant? AIDS drugs for Africa. Gore's greed kills. I helped with the order of the words. Lynch grinned with one side of her mouth and produced, as if out of thin air, a sticker for me, a gold star, as though she knew that I was best suited for watching than finding the words. And the rest of the book is those words. Thanks for listening.
Well, thanks so much for that great intro, Emily. I think you do such a great job of conjuring the activist milieu that I knew very well when I was in New York. As you mentioned, I was part of Fed Up Queers, and a lot of the people in Fed Up Queers are the activists you're talking about in the book. And I love the way that, the book in a lot of ways is focused around PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. But here you're showing the activist work that 5 years before that sort of underlies all of the analysis, the instigation, the tumult, all of the range of experiences that are not generally credited, right? We see like a heroic narrative that usually involves straight white men, even if it be, George W. Bush, right?
Yep.
People are like, oh, he's a war criminal, but he did something good. I was a hero. And so I love the way that you start us there, and you show us, what was a 3-month activist campaign to chase Gore around on his campaign rallies. And I remember when that was happening and people were like, running all over the place. And I was like, what the hell are you doing?
Everywhere. And I just couldn't figure out how anybody actually had jobs, which I still haven't figured out. I know when people ate or when they had jobs, but no, people were driving overnight. The Carthage crew drove up from Carthage, Tennessee, stopped to pick up some people, and then hit Manchester, New Hampshire the next day. And one of the effects of that was that the Gore campaign thought there were tons of activists, that there were activists everywhere. In fact, there was basically a handful.
Yeah, and it had such an amazing effect. I wonder if you want to, which of course we didn't know at the time. I mean, I didn't follow the Gore, but I mean, we, meaning broadly speaking, no one knows in the moment, like what is and what is not going to have like a more long-term effect, right? Because activism is really about challenging power and creating a culture of resistance and doing what is necessary to shift the systems of power. But of course, you have no idea whether anything is actually going to work. And so it's kind of fascinating that this small group of people in 3 months' time actually got, the pharmaceutical industry to drop that lawsuit. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that and the effects that had long-term.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so, one of the things that I realized as I was writing this book is that if you, there's a few things. I had arrived as a queer social justice activist in New York City, working at Out magazine, fact-checking the fashion spreads and the AIDS articles, and my biology degree made me useful to the writer of the HIV articles, Anne Christine Tedeschi. And from there, sort of arrived at a moment when this activist movement had set its sights on something. And so my first exposure was inside a movement that was extraordinarily effective, but because it was where I sort of started a certain era of social justice activism, I just thought this was how life worked. So you drove down to Carthage, and the next day in the A section of the New York Times, AIDS, drugs for Africa, like there's your chant. And there was a sense in that compressed period, and really in the next couple of years of making, as the activists like to say, making the impossible inevitable. And what they did was they got very strategic and very specific about the target and the ask, and it was bring the drug prices down, make the drugs affordable, make it shameful and unsustainable for these prices to be that high. And they took on first Gore, and then the USTR, the US Trade Representative's Office, backs off of the South African lawsuit. And then you turn to the companies themselves. And then you turn to the intellectual property restrictions that prevent the production of cheaper versions, which is all playing out again with COVID, right now. And they just took on one thing at a time. And it was one of the most profoundly powerful anti-capitalist interventions in the 21st century in terms of sort of what they did with drug company prices. And where I see that power among many places is that when Bush finally launches PEPFAR, right, in his State of the Union, he names the price that the activists want. He can start paying for drugs because the drugs are affordable, right? He names $300 a year, which is essentially the activist price. And in the legislation that authorizes PEPFAR, that price was redacted. So it was too dangerous to even put down in print, right? And the pharmaceutical industry didn't want it there. And you see these sort of, so the erasure is also the presence of the activists who in many ways are why PEPFAR is possible, but then have to sort of be reinserted into a story because the guy that landed on the aircraft carrier with Mission Impossible, accomplished behind a Mission Impossible, becomes the hero, right?
Yeah, I think, and you write also that, you can't talk about AIDS in Africa without also addressing poverty, debt, corruption, misogyny, white supremacy, homophobia, and capitalism, right? So that's the anti-capitalist underpinnings that you're talking about. Yeah. But then, of course, at the same time, any US government, whether it's Bush or Obama or Trump or Biden, is not going to challenge, the underpinnings of the US imperial project, right? So you talk a lot in the book about how PEPFAR brought, treatment for HIV to Africa on a large scale, saving millions of lives, but at the same time, by design, avoided addressing these larger structural issues. And I wonder if you want to talk about some of the problems that facilitated.
Yeah, I mean, and I just picked up your book, which I have here, right? Because I in Freeze the Door, you wrote, sometimes the violence of people allegedly trying to help is the worst kind of violence. And I think that one of the things we grapple with when we look at foreign aid on this scale that was immensely beneficial in terms for paying for pills to put into people's bodies, and in many countries actually for paying for the only programs that serve to this day gay men and other men who have sex with men and transgender people in countries where the governments criminalize those behaviors. And in many cases, in PEPFAR countries, the policy landscape is sometimes more favorable than it is in our own country, right? So our foreign aid investments have actually sometimes gotten ahead of our own sort of conservative and murderous policies here at home. And with all of those caveats, it is within the system. It is working within the system. It is foreign aid within a system that is not fundamentally seeking to change the way that power and wealth are distributed, right? And so it is a constant tension between, do you fight for the perpetuation of something that absolutely saves more lives day in or day out? Do you fight to tear the system down? Can you do both? And what does it mean to choose?
And what are your answers to that? Can you do both?
I mean, I think at heart, I'm something of a pragmatist. And for people living with HIV, the first and most important thing is access to medications. And there was, and I think still is on some level, a feeling that if you upend, if you disrupt, if you end an inequality in access to a specific commodity or a space, will that catalyze a sense of entitlement? Will that catalyze, in a positive way, will that catalyze demands for other things? Could this be the thin edge of the wedge? If we win X, will people rise up and then demand Y? And certainly when we were fighting for AIDS drugs in the early years of the 21st century, the belief was once we got AIDS drugs, it would then be healthcare for all. And there still really is that belief. And we're now sort of grappling with it within COVID. I think that focused demands and the wins associated with them fuel revolution. I think that's my answer, but it's a long game.
Yeah, I think you write really well about sort of the way that the definition of health changed. I think what you say is, you say when the pills arrived, physicians rewrote the definition of health. And you quote an Ugandan doctor as saying, when I started doing this work, there were more activists and doctors. Now there are so many accountants. And so you point to the ways that a program like PEPFAR, which does provide access to life-saving medications, it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of life for people who survive necessarily improves, due to economic precarity, due to poverty, due to gender-based violence, or any of the other issues that they're facing. And at the same time as PEPFAR, goes on over the years, it becomes more focused on these kinds of performance metrics that are about, graphs and data points and not really about people's lives. And you mentioned in some ways you take apart some of the terminology that I really like, treatment mortgage, which is the most horrifying.
It is.
And so I wonder if you want to talk more about like those kinds of critiques that you offer in the book.
I mean, PEPFAR has sort of two sets of clientele, right? It has to keep, in order to be funded across 8 Congresses and 3 presidents, it has to keep Congress happy. And in order to make Congress happy, the one thing that the Republicans and the Democrats agree on is pills into bodies, right? Across all of the years, and in spite of all of the other differences of opinion about women's bodily autonomy and harm reduction and just about everything else, everybody agrees you get pills into people's bodies. And the science backs that up, not only for the individual health, but for prevention. If people on treatment have an undetectable viral load, they are far less likely to transmit. And so there become this idea sort of arrives scientifically, but then also kind of rhetorically, right after the treatment mortgage, which is an Obama era nugget, right, of basically we can't afford this ballooning entitlement of dependence, all real language from the government, the Obama-Biden administration, about Black and brown people with HIV in Africa. You have the sort of flip side, which is equally cynical, which is an investment case for, and a return on investment case for paying for treatment for those people, which is if you spend a lot now, you can save more in the future because you're going to spend a lot, there's going to be fewer HIV infections, and then you're going to be able to sort of pull back your investment. And so it becomes a very, very capitalist and very sort of cynical rhetoric around what we're doing that really boils down to the idea of epidemic control. It's no longer about changing the world. It's just about, can we control an epidemic? And again, you have to, given our current circumstances, the sort of the realpolitik of that, the utility of controlling an epidemic is not to be sniffed at. It is not the same as addressing gender-based violence and all of these other issues. And yet at the same time, there is a way that this laser focused goal that is embodied most by Deborah Birx, who then becomes the coronavirus coordinator with her scarves and her moment with the bleach, right? She embodies this data focused and laser focused moment. And it does bring some countries close to epidemic control without changing poverty and precarity.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the way you bring up drugs into bodies, which of course emerged from ACT UP in the early years. Mm-hmm. Before, of course, at that point, the only thing the government agreed on was that dead bodies, dying queers, dying, drug users. That was all great.
Yep.
It was not, not any issue. And it was ACT UP that fought successfully, for that slogan and for access to drugs and for changing the CDC definition to include, women. It's interesting, actually, in Sarah Schulman's book, Let the Record Show, about ACT UP New York from 87 to 93. One of the things I think that a lot of the activists who she interviewed as part of the ACT UP Oral History Project seemed to agree was that one of the failures of ACT UP was that the focus on access, universal access, never really came to the fore, like universal healthcare, universal access to medication, to treatment, to prevention. And it's interesting because PEPFAR and the group, the starting point you have is already about access, right? And but at the same time, what you're pointing to is that it's still that same issue, right? It's about access, but there isn't a way to change those larger structures. And I think Deborah Burke's actually in your book, I feel like that's a really haunting part of the book, because you talk about how she becomes the head of PEPFAR. She has, this very regimented way of organizing, of leadership, of structuring, and then she becomes the under what's his name, Trump.
I don't remember.
And so you point out that time when he's they're on live TV together, and he's saying, oh, you can just inject bleach, and that's going to solve, that's going to cure COVID-19. And here she is just looking at the ground and doing nothing. And so it's that haunting, because here's someone who is very efficient at inhabiting systems of power, right? But when she thinks that she can still handle, something else, and is unwilling to speak out, right? And I feel like that's that tension when people, she of course started in the military. She was always inside, a murderous system trying to do something else. So it's not like she started as an activist, but I feel like there is this tension between existing outside, like at the beginning of the book, the section you're reading from, you're talking about this inside-outside strategy, right? So activists are outside chasing Gore on the campaign trail. So that's very outside. But as the book progresses, a lot of the activists are not exactly outside, because they're inside nonprofits, they're providing services. And so it's more like a somewhat outside, it's like somewhat inside and more inside, right? And so that dynamic in some ways gets lost. And so I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit.
I think there's a lot there, right? Which is, and I would say though even at those very initial moments, right, when they're chasing around Donna Brazile, they go up to Manchester, New Hampshire, and they pick up Rachel Maddow, and they go stand behind Gore and they disrupt the second event in 2 days. And he says, "Who are you people?" And then Donna Brazile chases one of the activists outside and says, "What do you people want?" Because it seems like they're legions. And the activist she apprehends, as he recalls, Paul Davis says, they want her to write a letter. They want the Congressional Black Caucus to write a letter to Gore, and then they help write the letter, right? There's actually no point at which the activists are not playing within the political system. And I think that's one thing that that is sort of interesting to pick up and call out about most activism, but certainly this era, is that there's no point at which this sort of street savvy, shock and awe sort of theater is not also doing the analysis and presenting the white papers and making the arguments. And to me, again, sort of sitting in the center of it, all I saw was the street activism. It was really through the sort of going back and reconstructing it that I realized that at every stage there was also this just incredible brainy analysis behind it. But I do think there is something, what you're saying is really evocative. Also, this idea, whether it's a movement or of an individual like Ambassador Birx, how far inside the system can you go without capitulating or losing your edge or losing your ability to influence? And how do you know when you've gotten there, and when have you lost the ability to sort of calibrate your own judgment? And I think that certainly I think Burke's raised a lot of questions about that, but I think moving through the activist movement for as long as this book does, and it does become increasingly hard to see the kinds of activism that are taking place, and that I really, it's kind of assert are happening behind closed doors with African activists and Africans living with HIV really taking on structures of power. If you can't see it, what does it mean? And what does it mean for sort of object lessons about change? And is it okay if the game is all inside? And do you know?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, the book, your book takes place basically over 20 years. So this is a book that you were working on since 2001, I think, in one form or another. And I think one of the things you do a really good job is like that's showing through this personal lens, which is your own experience, and also this sort of journalistic investigation, and then also a sort of structural or systemic analysis. And I wonder actually if you want to talk a little bit just about that process, that writing process, that organization of the book, what you learned as you were working on it.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to Uganda in 2004 to write about PEPFAR, and I said that I announced to everybody I'm going to Uganda. I'm going to write a book. I told everybody when I got there I was going to write a book, and I did. It took a really long time. But the reason I moved, in part, was because the activists, some of whom you met in that section I read, thought PEPFAR was bullshit, right? I'm not sure if there's a family-friendly thing. Plug your kids' ears.
Bullshit. We can say
my kids are watching it. If they're watching, they're so excited. Cussing is exciting. But and Bush gave them every reason to think so. I mean, he turned around the next day or 2 days later, and his budget request was far less than the $3 billion you would expect if you were taking $15 billion over 5 years, right? So it looks like he's nickel and diming. He's certainly not using the Global Fund, which is this kind of post-neoliberal, up from the grassroots model of letting poor countries make their plans and finance them. And it exists to this day, and it's important to COVID, and it's also in the book. But people hated it and critiqued it, or I thought they hated it and critiqued it. And again, I was sort of watching from the periphery because I was a B-list activist, right? So I wasn't privy to all of the sort of calculations about this. And I was mad, right? I mean, in a way, I moved to Uganda because I wanted to find out if it was really bullshit, or was some, and was the Global Fund better than PEPFAR? And in another way, I kind of wanted to know if this phase of my activist life was perhaps coming to an end, right? Had we won, could I move on? Could I go back to writing, poetry and and sort of this idea, right, that perhaps I would just tell the story and then in some way have done what I thought I could contributed what I thought I could offer, being the person that watched and wrote things down. And people have sort of said to me, like, 20 years, and what do you I'm part of why I told the story for that long is because the epidemic's been going on for that long. I mean, that's the other life happened, but like the pandemic, AIDS is ongoing at pandemic levels, and no, the story wasn't going to end in 2 years or 3 years or 4 years. And so I figured that out, among other things.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's actually a real strength of the book, and I think any book. Like, I think people think a book is something you write in a few years. A book is a work of our lives, right? And I think you really do draw from so many ranges of experience. And I think you've mentioned a few times COVID, actually, which I think comes up, of course, at the end of the book because it's about to be published, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, you have no way of predicting anything that that's happening 20 years ago or even 3 years ago. But I think one of the tragedies, in a sense, is here is this model for bringing treatment on a large scale, to countries that do not have access. And here we are 20 years after that, or I guess, 15, 16, 17, 18 years after that. And it's the same tragedy, right? Which,
Yep.
you know, rich countries are hoarding the vaccine, are, you know, patent rights are the same, you know, patent rights over people's lives. It's the same, it's like the exact same thing, right? It was like, we need to have treatment at $300 rather than at, you know, $10,000, right? And so, but here's the same thing where, like, you know, millions of people are just going to die or not have access. And then years later, maybe like something will arrive. And I think that's the, I think that is how that the systems of power always sort of regroup, right? That's that tragedy of not having like the anti-capitalist, like all of the activists have that anti-capitalist analysis, and that's where it's coming from. That's where the knowledge is coming from. That's how the treatment is able to take place. But here we are again, and over and over and over again. I mean, this is just the most obvious example in our current moment. But I think, and I think in some way, you know, you really show this sort of, you're not talking about COVID, of course, but you show this sort of human cost, you know, on an individual level of that bureaucratization, even as treatment is made, you know, available, there's still the cost of people's lives. But I guess, you know, I just wonder, and I guess this is, of course, we don't have the answers to these questions, but it is really sad to see the same thing happening. You know, sad is like an understatement, right? It's devastating, you know, and when here it is, here's this whole model right here already,
Yep.
right? And so I wonder if you want to talk to that.
I mean, I'm thinking about it all the time because it's like, it's sad on a few different levels. And one of them is that for all of the ways that COVID seems like it's prompting an unprecedented examination of global health and global health security, what you have, you know, much like, you know, going into Iraq, which, you know, Bush does at the same time that he launches PEPFAR, is you have a continuation and elaboration of ideas about how to be in the world that have existed for a long time. And the folks that are in the, right now is a moment where the US could certainly be having a PEPFAR-esque moment with COVID, and it could have a really ambitious plan with a presidential imprimatur and targets and a huge amount of money. And it could say, look, all these agencies have to work together. And, you know, and there are various calls, you know, 1 billion vaccines distributed by the end of this year and up to 2 billion. And let's aim for 60% of the world's population vaccinated by 2022. And if you notice, when we announce these 500 million or 80 million, all these things that are happening, it's not against a target. It's not against a denominator that the US has adopted. And what Bush does when he launches PEPFAR is he says, I'm going to give $15 billion and I want, in 5 years, I want 2 million people on treatment. And, you know, you have to be able to talk about how significant that is without being dinged for lionizing a war criminal. And I think that's one of the difficulties of the book, right? Is that what he did was really important. And we need that to happen now with COVID. You have to have presidential leadership, a budget, a target, and a whole system moving. And one of the tragedies is that we don't have that. In part, we don't have that because the same folks that kind of didn't want PEPFAR to happen sort of don't want this to happen, right? The US development industry likes things to be the way that it is.
Yeah, and I think also, oh, and I want to remind people, if you have any questions, just throw them in the Q&A. I don't see any questions yet, but if you have any, we'll just bring them on. Feel free to ask anything you want. And I think, you know, to speak again I just think, you know, the one issue about patents, right? Like that's the thing that starts off this whole, you know, the whole mechanism, right? It's that, you know, like forcing the drug companies to actually make generic drugs available, right? And that, so I feel like if that had changed at a systemic level, we would not have this issue like with vaccines because they wouldn't be patented in the first place, you know? And so for me, I just, that's the tragedy that I keep seeing, right? And I think, yeah, and I think, yeah, I guess, I don't know if you have more thoughts on that, or of course that, you know, that isn't sort of the exact topic of your book, but even just that underpinning, right? That moment when activists forced the pharmaceutical industry to drop, you know, that demand that, you know, that generic drugs could not be distributed. like what could have made that moment or could make that moment now permanent, or like
Right.
actual like systemic change. And of course it means, the pharmaceutical industry has to be forced to do that. I mean, obviously the only thing they care about is profiting over people's dead bodies, right? If people are alive and that makes them more money, then they'll keep them alive. If they're dead and that makes them more money, then they let them die, right? So I guess there's that same question, right? Which is underpinning, I mean, it was a question in ACT UP and remains a question in ACT UP. It's a question in AIDS activism across the board. It's a question that starts your book. And here's this question still now.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a few practical things. And one thing is that you need to switch from this model of aid, and I'm going to give you this, and I'm going to parcel out these doses, and I'm going to donate stuff to you too. Here are the ingredients, here's the know-how, and we're going to invest in manufacturing capacity, right? You can do all these things. There is capacity in South Africa to make vaccines. There's capacity outside of the global north to make vaccines. And so part of it is actually transferring in this, power in these forms of commodities, ingredients, all of these different things, and sort of really creating a world where one portion or one geography is not reliant on the other. And then the other piece of it is, again, sort of understanding that the investment has to be systemic. It's not just about buying the vaccines, but about a whole health system that can deliver vaccines to adults, which by the way, like doesn't happen, right? In most parts of the world. You have childhood immunization, including ours. And that system requires health workers and training and messaging and all the stuff that aids drugs, which also there was no system for providing anything to adults. I did see Alex asked a question, and I wanted to, and I want thank you for raising that, Alex, and for giving me a chance to belatedly hold and create space for what is a raging, tragic COVID epidemic right now in many countries, particularly in Uganda, which is the country where I spent the most time reporting this book. It's devastating. It's devastating. There's not a family or a community that I'm in touch with that isn't impacted directly by this. And so primarily you're asking, for those of you that are not checking the chat, are you hearing from your friends and colleagues about their needs and activism around COVID? I mean, their needs right now, we are really in a survival moment. People need vaccines, but they also need ambulances, they need oxygen, they need access to the same treatments that are available here. They need healthcare workers who aren't dying because they're on the front lines. And this is what happens when you haven't had a sustained and expanded investment in health equity. HIV is a part of it, but it's not the beginning and the end. And the other thing that I hear a lot from women living with HIV is about gender-based violence and forced marriage and coerced sex and unplanned pregnancies and access to contraception, which continues to be something that PEPFAR does not pay for and should pay for. So it's a global tragedy unfolding.
Yeah, and here's a follow-up question actually in the Q&A along similar lines. It says, activists are the reason drug prices dropped. They are the reason that most people living with HIV have access to life-saving drugs. We haven't seen that sort of urgency among activists with COVID. What would you recommend to be done to change this, to bring more urgency and more agency?
So I think it's a great question. And Angela's from Uganda, and so is definitely one of those on the front lines as well, though based here in the US. I mean, I think one thing is to say there is activism happening, and look at Marked by COVID, look at a group called Right to Health Action. And Right to Health Action, actually, one of the folks leading it, it's led by an amazing group of young med students and medical professionals, but one of the folks helping to sort of shape it is Paul Davis, who was chased out of Manchester, New Hampshire by Donna Brazile a million years ago. And there is this continuity. So there is activism. I think that a couple of things are standing in the way. One of them is at least in the US, is our faith in government, our desire to play an inside game was pretty much destroyed by the last 4 years, right? So this idea that you would actually, as an activist, want to get involved in making the government do something and climbing inside that beast, right? Is I think for some people kind of horrifying. And yet that's where this is going to come from. We've got to start. There's legislation that's been proposed, right? It's going to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee next week that would create a pandemic prevention fund, And there are activists pouring over it. And I want to say we need more of that, but I also know that when it came to AIDS and PEPFAR, we didn't have that many. But so I would say that there is urgency, and there's a lot of opportunity, and it's sort of exactly what it was like, back in the late 90s. I mean, nobody said, hey, what you guys need to do is drive to Carthage and, play hooky from your day jobs. It was a sense of imperative, and that's possible. I think we have to be willing to accept that the solutions will come from the state, right? And that again is that kind of like inside outside game moment.
Let's see. Well, if we don't have any other questions, let's see. Oh no. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to add, Emily? I'm still curious to hear more about your writing process, because you're able to synthesize so many different kinds of writing into one book. And I think also you're able to, I think in some ways it's easier to write like a dry kind of clinical, distant book. But what you're able to do is to make it seem very casual. But at the same time, you're so meticulous about, all these different levels, from the personal to the political, to the institutional, to the systemic, and over so many years. So I'm curious to hear more about that process.
I mean, look, you don't want to get it wrong with the AIDS activists. The people I'm talking about, like you certainly, you try to come correct when you're telling their story. So part of it was, if I'm going to do this, I really need to get it 100% right. And I went to Uganda because I sort of disagreed with an assessment of what had happened. And then kind of, through the process of sitting in clinics, a story emerged that was about different US government agencies and sort of in Shakespearean levels of internecine drama between USAID and CDC, which who knew, right? Fascinating, kind of fun, kind of horrifying. But it's a lot of the process is just sitting there and watching what happens, right? Like that is, I'm the one that sits there and eventually finds the words. And so, I think the other thing is that books tell you what they need to be, right? And I sort of say jokingly, there's a girl who hurts my feelings in the book, and when I started, a million years ago, I was mostly writing about getting my feelings hurt, and it turned out that in order to make sense of how you get your heart broken in the midst of a global AIDS activist movement, you need people to understand the global AIDS activist movement. Right. And so that book needs to be written. That book doesn't exist, and now it does. So it's, for me, it's always a process of, it really is, what did I know and what did I not know at the time? Right. And then what's always interesting is to stay in the frame and fill in the pieces that I didn't know at the time, and to try to figure out how to know in the present and retrospectively, and kind of hold those things together. And that's been, in some ways, that's the most fun part of it.
Well, great. That seems like a great place to end. People, there's some great comments in the chat, so people feel free to light up the chat. Congratulations, Emily. This is the publication date for the book. Everyone, don't forget to order your copies from Books Are Magic. And thanks for coming tonight.
And thank you, Mattilda. Thank you so much.